Summertime. Perhaps you're thinking of taking a cruise. If you've ever stood beside a cruise ship, they're massive, 10 stories tall. They're literally a city on the water. And they're a smart city on the water. Think about it. A cruise ship consists of several life-critical systems, and original equipment manufacturers install and maintain those individual systems, such as navigation, engine controls, water treatment, waste treatment. Because they're so specialized, often individual manufacturers retain remote access for support through always-on VPN connections. This creates significant risk, as a single compromised OEM access could jeopardize the operational environment of the ship. Maybe you're not taking a cruise. Maybe you're driving and you see a vast data center just off the road. That data center has ancillary systems, like HVAC and fire suppression. What if a third party that controls those gets compromised? Really, the question is, what happens when a cruise ship gets hit with ransomware in the middle of a journey? Or what happens when the HVAC or fire suppression system at a data center is compromised? Do we really have to wait until that happens to find out? Perhaps we need to rethink OT aspects of this. Instead of providing individual vendor access, what about having maritime and data centers handle the communication with all the devices themselves? This is a story about OT systems that you might not be thinking about and what security controls can be put in place. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
Hi, I'm Bill Moore. I'm founder and CEO of Xona Systems. We were founded about 7 years ago, really for the sole purpose of providing more simple and secure access to your most critical infrastructure systems. Typically operational technology, HMI, SCADA systems, PLCs, and so forth that exist, to run the world, whether it's in energy, oil and gas, manufacturing, transportation, and so forth.
I previously spoke with Bill in episode 53 of Error Code, where we talked about how you can virtualize the OT network and interact with it, adding 2FA and encryption. Security world, it spends a lot of time focusing on IT networks and IT security. All the while, in the background, there's been OT. OT predates IT.
Look, so IT networks, became the internet very quickly, over the last 20, 25 years, right? 25 years, really back in the late 90s, 2000s when the internet really, really took off, right? And everybody was connecting, to wider networks and sharing information, remotely and everywhere, right? So OT really kind of didn't move like that, right? OT sort of sat there in the background for the most part, completely disconnected from IT and disconnected from the internet. They were, running, just about air gap for the most part. It's only over the last 10 years that I think, these networks have started, either, and it started out really pushing some data to some application that would sit in the cloud that you could analyze some of the data coming out of the OT network, but no inbound connection. So when I started the company 7 years ago, the first 2 or 3 years, I talked to a power generation plant, control system supervisor, and he would say, we will never ever allow remote operations into a power plant. Just will never happen. And then, fast forward to today, you had COVID in there in between. It changed even for, very, very critical systems at a power plant, right? And now we see unmanned power plants, where they're controlling it, from another power plant or remotely or whatever. So it's moved pretty quickly. And you have this kind of, a lot of those assets too are being digitized. So there's this big digital transformation going on. So OT is blurring into looking more like IT because in the past, you'd have, PLCs and things like that and these kind of obscure HMI systems that maybe ran some really strange version of Linux or Windows or something. But now there's a lot of regular systems that are in the OT network that are really more IT systems, right? And those IT systems are talking internet protocols, they're talking TCP/IP. So I think there's been this slow, I always talk about OT networks as kind of the networks that time forgot. I mean, you go into some of the networks that are now just starting to connect and like, why are you running Telnet on this network, right? And because, Telnet disappeared 20, 25 years ago in the IT networks because it was just so insecure, right? But, oh, well, that's the way we connect to. Like, you can't use that.
And with OT, you can put security controls and you can turn off those insecure protocols. You can do things at the network level. But still, it's the device itself that's needing to be secured from the very beginning.
It's really about how do we put modern controls, privilege access management, modern multi-factor authentication, modern encryption, all of those things to make sure that the connections to those critical systems are protected, right? And not expose those antiquated systems that can't be patched anymore, that are running, insecure communications and keep that kind of in a controlled environment so that they're not accessible or easily accessible outside of that critical network.
The last time I talked with Bill, we spoke about the usual suspects: energy, oil, gas, transportation. What are some of the other areas that Bill is looking into?
We also have customers in the Department of Defense, as well as, and I actually look at DoD as kind of a horizontal, not as a vertical, because it can include a lot of the heavy industries as well. But we're starting to see a lot within data center management. With all the AI coming out, we're seeing more of an interest in sort of a more secure way of accessing data center infrastructure. Maritime is an area where we're seeing quite a bit. We have a very large maritime customer where we provide secure OEM third-party access to critical operational technology on cruise ships.
So, with maritime, are we talking about the ports or are we talking about the vessels?
So we have customers in both. We have customers that are protecting, systems where, there's obviously you have automation around unloading and offloading cargo in a port. A lot of those are automated systems now, that, obviously is critical infrastructure, and obviously there's safety and availability concerns, with those types of systems. Um, yeah, and so with ships, we see that with, both cruise ships and cargo. We have, as I mentioned, one very large cruise customer, and then we are working with actually several other right now, other maritime customers that are more cargo oriented.
So, with transportation, there's some attention being paid to supply pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, well, I can start with maritime. One of our customers, what drove them to our solution is, and this is kind of a trend, not just in maritime, but I'm seeing also manufacturing and other industrial sectors, is there was this idea that the OEM puts in the system, whether it's a manufacturing line or automation on the manufacturing floor, whatever it may be in that particular sector. And they own the access, they own the support, they own making sure everything's running, right? But up until recently, there wasn't this, hey, I also, we actually own these assets, even though they're being operated by our OEM. And this is, whether it's Rockwell or GE or Siemens or ABB. It doesn't matter, right? It's you know, do we know what kind of access they're using and is it secure to our critical systems? So in maritime, what happened is they had many, we'll say more than a dozen different OEMs that would connect to different types of critical systems on the cruise vessel, right? So one may be uh, the navigation system, right? One could be the distributed control system that provides visibility into all subsystems. You could have engine control room. You could have water and wastewater, because it is a city, floating city, right, on the water. So there's a lot of operational technology and critical systems, and each OEM would maybe have a piece of that, right? So um, they were compromised through an always-on VPN connection because they didn't recognize that owning the asset meant they also owned the risk that of compromise of a group, compromising and hacking into those systems, right? And so that obviously got up to the board level because you have the safety of passengers and not, with compromise of those systems and so forth. So um, they decided, hey, no more, right? We have to tell the Siemens and the GEs and the ABBs and the Emersons and all of these big OEMs, you can no longer use your own solution to connect to the network, right? You have to come through our solution. So, and we're gonna audit it, and we're gonna, be able to go back and watch a movie of what you did. And, they're very transparent on that. And some of them were like, hey, great, I don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't have to worry about my own access. And others were like, no, what do you mean? I don't want to use your system. So but that's a trend that I'm seeing is super important because the supply chain as security aspect, when the asset owner or the people that are running these industrial systems, whether it's maritime or manufacturing or oil and gas, whatever it may be, there's massive safety involved, right? If they don't have visibility and forensic knowledge of who accessed what, when, how long and so forth, especially if there is an incident, cybersecurity incident, being able to go back and track that is vitally important. So that's a trend that is happening as we speak. Um, Across the board, there's a recognition. We're seeing not only directors of OT cybersecurity roles that have been put into, and this is mainly medium to large, enterprise companies, but also security architects that are looking at this problem and making sure that solutions are being put in that reduce the attack surface, reduce the risk, reduce the exposure of these critical systems. So
All this sounds like the automotive industry as an analogy, where, the OEM sells the car, but the pieces of the car, well, they're produced by tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 vendors. Ultimately, I think the security is with the OEM automaker, but there's still the people behind the scenes that are producing the tech.
yeah, that's a great analogy, right? Because if you have a car manufacturer, and obviously there's been stories about folks hacking, into the car and unlocking the car or whatever, using computers or whatever. That's not, yeah, that wasn't the OEM that provided that to that wasn't the tier two OEM that provided that to Hyundai or Toyota or whoever it is, right? That, that's not their problem, right? Because the consumers, the brand, is really the OE is the tier one, right? It's going to be, you know, Toyota can't sit there and go, oh, well, that was a system that we bought, and by XYZ OEM, they should have put security in it. Nobody's going to care, right? They're going to say, no, Toyota, or no, Hyundai, you're the problem, right? And so that's kind of, that's sort of what we're seeing here with these large companies, manufacturers or across the board, right? Whether it's energy, manufacturing, transportation. Yeah, they recognize they can't point the finger here that it's their brand at stake.
So the data center, that's very interesting to me. What with all the AI buildup and so forth, we're talking still about OT in those environments. We're talking about the HVAC system and controls that keep the facility up and running.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it could be HVAC systems, it could be, could be fire suppression systems, things like that. Yeah, a lot of that is now, automated and all the climate controls and things like that are certainly automated and computer systems generally manage those systems. Yeah.
I find these OT systems are overlooked when people are talking about critical infrastructure. People still think about the grid and only the grid. They don't think about the other things that are going on behind the scenes in our day-to-day lives, such as with a data center. You could cripple the HVAC system. You could take out the fire control system in those data centers and easily compromise them in a cyber attack.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And with data centers, there's really a lot of it, there's a lot of automation and understanding because a lot of this is scaling and they're really building out and adding a lot of compute and storage and so forth, to handle the increase in requirements around AI, right? I saw it might have been a podcast actually where they talked about the difference between doing a chat GPT search versus a normal Google search, even though now Google is implementing AI as well. But initially it was, 20 times the amount of processing power to ask, AI a question versus a search, on something, in a search engine. So obviously you're going to need eventually at least 20x the processing capabilities that we've had in the past. So, that goes into energy requirements. So we're seeing a lot of, also additional backup storage, across the board, right? More capacity in sort of gas power generation, but a ton more in these like new battery technologies, battery backup, for buildings and certainly for data centers as well.
So, looking at the different industries that are out there, how are we positioned against a nation state attack?
I am seeing folks starting to pay more attention to it, and some of the compliance is getting teeth in it. I think of NERC and some of the new regulations for not just what they call high impact systems, and we'll just talk about energy for a moment. That's generally around power generation, where high impact would be 100 megawatts or more of power gen, and so that's they've had pretty stringent requirements on separation of the network there, obviously, multi-factor authentication, all of that, and encryption and really taking more of a zero trust approach to it for high impact. But the new regulations coming out next year in April, also, I think 003-9 include, medium and low impact. So what's interesting about that is that's now wind farms, right? And some of these other dual use. Sometimes they're a combination of solar, battery, and wind. But wherever there's like a generating facility and renewables, or peaker plants, that may be on temporarily, and maybe smaller plants that may be less than 100 megawatts. I mean, these are now all falling under what's called medium and low impact. So that's the good news, at least in the energy sector. I think there's a lot of fragmented policies across, all of the different industrial sectors. They all have kind of their own things and they're all, at different phases of that. And, I think they're still in reaction mode to what's going on in the industry in terms of, the nation state, APT threats from that, or just, really garden variety ransomware, right? And some of the ransomware as a service groups and so forth. So, I mean, they're seem to be constantly playing catch up but I think at least on the compliance side, it seems to be moving in the right direction. Kind of having sort of all those fragmented into one sort of standard. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but IEC 62443 it's been interesting. Just recently, Australia decided for all their industrial sectors to standardize on that, which I think is really good, because they're recognizing, hey, we need, one kind of source of compliance truth, if you will. So yeah, so that's kind of the good news. The bad news is, we're dealing with still massively underfunded security for very legacy systems and very really hard to upgrade. And when we start talking about utilities like water and wastewater, energy pipelines, all of these are running generally older control systems. The HMIs and the SCADA systems and the underlying Windows and Linux is generally not being patched very regularly. It could be very old operating systems that are not even being supported anymore. Like with Microsoft, for instance, with Windows, old Windows systems. So those are some really that's very problematic. And so the challenge there is, how do we move to a place where we can be not just, hey, we got visibility and we know what they are, that's great. But, can we start implementing more active defense where we can, make sure that who's accessing is using the right level of, MFA, strong authentication, and very granular authorization, and then being able to audit that access and be able to have the right safety controls, human in the loop, and things like that, to make sure that it's the right person accessing these systems and we're not allowing, um, people to not have the validation right from folks outside accessing coming into those critical systems, right?
I know last summer there was a lot of discussion around smaller water districts that were being hit. And in one case, it was the cyber avengers out of Iran.
There's a lot of talk about, the nation states and things like that. And I think, the way that, what we're seeing in terms of Iran or any other adversaries, obviously they're, the biggest worry, and I think the biggest risk is in, the utility sector right now, and particularly in energy, pipelines and water and wastewater. And I think they're probably a little bit behind manufacturing, but I think the good news is, the recognition and the compliance and things are pushing, um, those folks to move in the right direction. Could be faster though.
Are we seeing some of the smaller players impacted first with some of these nation state attacks simply because they have legacy systems up and running and they're not updating them as often?
Yeah, I think it's generally. I mean, it's sort of low hanging fruit, right? A lot of these, especially rural systems, they're exposing their networks, to the internet, because I mean, frankly, you may only have one person that's responsible for the SCADA systems, the IT systems, and the cybersecurity for some of these small water utilities, right? And they're trying to figure out a way of reducing the amount of time, and they're like, oh, somebody comes in and says, hey, you can just check all of your treatment plants, for this cloud system, and hey, everything will update, and if there's a problem, it'll tell you which plant you got to go to and whatever you need to do, as opposed to driving out to every site, blah blah blah. Okay, that's attractive, and they're not going to ask, they may be a skate engineer. They're not going to ask, well, what kind of cybersecurity? I mean, are you following IEC 64? They don't even know a lot of that stuff, right? And some of these, these smaller county, municipal water utilities, for instance. I mean, I think, those are going to be low hanging fruit, because what will happen is somebody puts in something that maybe helps them be more efficient, be able to have better visibility, but it's also sharing their critical infrastructure and those critical systems, to the internet, right? And so and it doesn't have to be group, Cyber Avenger group. It can be, a bored freshman in high school that just likes, playing around and hacking around on the internet, right? And he's got on Shodan and he's seeing these systems and he goes, oh, let me see if I can, look up the default password for this piece of equipment that's showing up and goes right in, right? And does stuff. So, yeah, those are going to be low-hanging fruit, right? All day long. But some of the larger water utilities, they're also could be exposed here because again, some of the aging infrastructure and there's always things that get misconfigured and things like that. So if there's folks that are more sophisticated and they want to get into maybe a larger municipality, they can focus a lot of attention to that, right? And try to find, through social media and fish different emails and things like that to try to get, to get into the network and try to live off the land there. So I mean, there's different approaches, right? I think smaller utilities are just going to be easier for sure, just because they're under-resourced and they're not paying attention.
So I want to speak about the motivations of some of these attackers. It could be that they want to go after the smaller utilities to flex and sort of say, like, look what we can do. But in reality, it's like, they're outliers. And you don't really have the massive strength that you're projecting, for example.
I kind of feel like and not to take a diplomatic approach to this, but it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think it could go either way, right? I mean, I think, yeah, there could be certain groups that are going out and just trying to, create, you know, some buzz around what they're doing for whatever reason. I can't speculate to, all the motivation behind that, other than, to make a point. But at the same time, they could be, one thing that they could be doing is focusing on one area, but they have kind of, they're running multiple tracks, right? They could be focused on a much more complex, major metropolitan area utility, and whether water or energy at the same time, and they could be creating noise in these rural areas just to kind of throw that up, right, while they're doing, living off the land somewhere else, right? Distract away from other, maybe another industrial sector. I don't know, Hey, let's pay attention to water. We're going to be over here in pipelines or water, or in energy or something, in energy gen or something, So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question.
But over in the telecom space, it's quite the opposite. Apparently, there's some stealth stuff going on where the malware or whatever it is being placed there but not activated for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't really spent much time, in the telecom area. We've had some discussions, but really, most of my focus has been in sort of the utilities and energy, oil and gas and manufacturing.
So earlier we talked about NERC and FERC, and these are industry-driven standards, and to some degree that makes sense because they would know the energy business better than anyone else and be able to come up with those baseline standards. I'm wondering if Bill is seeing any other industries going down that same path, or are they expecting some sort of blanket ISO or government regulation to come out that'll cover a lot of different industries and make it easy?
So the answer is yes, and and again, it's somewhat fragmented because there's certain both geographically, like in Europe, there's NIS2. That's a standard. It's similar in many ways to IEC 6443. I think that one, which kind of is, initially was ISA 99, I believe, and then it kind of the IEC 6443 took over. I mean, I think that's probably the closest we have to an international standard for industrial control systems, and security around that. But, again, there's going to be this sort of either industry specific stuff like NERC SIP, and which is more North America for energy. and then NIS2, which is more of a European standard, and there's ones in Australia and Saudi as well. I've also seen things that are very specific in transportation around TSA and the security directive there that seems to be getting a lot of the pipeline people moving, in getting, shoring up their defenses and security. So, um, I mean, fortunately, some of these standards are pushing these companies to adopt better security, right? Better defense, better visibility, and a better understanding of their vulnerabilities. Um, I mean, it's unfortunate that it takes compliance, with potential fines to get them moving, but it is what it is, right? You would think they would just go, wow, seen a lot in the news. We need to fix this. Now, in manufacturing, I see seems to be a more pronounced focus, not just on the compliance side, but also because they are very, very worried about ransomware taking down manufacturing lines. Um, so manufacturing, it seems to be kind of, operationally driven as much as it is compliance driven.
Finally, where are we in terms of the summer of 2025? Are we seeing progress, or are we still seeing legacy systems getting connected to the internet with telnet still enabled?
You still see that even today. It's just sort of, as these things open up and more digital assets and more data, more analysis and more analytics. There's so much great operational data that can be extracted. And so, I mean, there's certainly business reasons for it, but they're fragile, right? Because they're just, it's set it and forget it, right? There are systems that have been running for decades. So, yeah, and they're not upgrading overnight now. They're like, oh, now we're connected to the internet or IT. We got to upgrade all our systems. It's not working like that. It's a very, very slow process, right? To kind of upgrade those systems and put in secure by design systems. So.
I'd like to thank Bill Moore for coming on the show and talking about some OT systems like maritime and data center that you might not be thinking about today, and what we might do to secure those systems now. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts, and I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up, including more on quantum cryptography, hacking common office items, and more on utilities. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.